The Color Purple by Alice Walker. If you haven't read it, imagine a book that feels like a long, honest letter from someone who has been forced to be quiet for years, and then chooses to speak. That's Sally's voice. She writes to God, later to her sister Nettie, and through those letters, we watch a person who has been stripped of dignity and identity slowly reclaim both. On the surface, it's a story about terrible things: racism, sexual and domestic abuse, poverty. Those are the reasons the book landed on banned lists and why some people called it indecent. But what censors often miss is the other half of the story. The tenderness, the humor, the friendships that stitch Seeley back together. Walker doesn't sanitize pain. She names it, and because she names it, healing becomes possible. That rawness is what made me, and so many readers, feel seen. There's a strange comfort in reading a truth that's allowed to be ugly and also to be hopeful. One thing I keep coming back to is how Walker gives voice to women who've been told to shut up. Seeley, Shug, Sophia, Nettie, they're different in temperament and fate, but each resists silence in her own way. Shug's music and unapologetic love, Sophia's refusal to bow, Nettie's letters from Africa, those threads show that strength isn't just one big heroic act. It's a million small reclaimings, speaking back, teaching, loving yourself, choosing companionship over submission. I remember finishing the book and feeling oddly energized and hollow at once, like I'd sat in a room where someone finally unlocked the door and let light in. That's the paradox. The brutality Walker shows makes the moments of joy and liberation feel earned, not easy. It's why readers called the book Truth. It doesn't shy away from how complicated healing is. It also refuses to let pain be an endpoint. For anyone watching who has ever been silenced, the book hits differently. There's a line in Seeley's voice that translates into something universal. You can survive things that were meant to break you, and your story matters. If you've ever wanted to speak about something heavy but worried about judgment, Seeley's letters can feel like permission to put your own words down. That's powerful in a quiet, steady way. Yes, it's controversial. Yes, it's hard. But very few books balance that kind of honest suffering with the possibility of transformation as skillfully as Walker does. The Color Purple reminds us that telling the truth about our worst experiences is a form of resistance, and that in telling the truth we often find strength we didn't think we had. Now, Khaled Hosseini's The Kite Runner. Set against the sweeping, often heartbreaking backdrop of Afghanistan, it's a story people tried to silence, banned in some places for the way it shows trauma, class divisions, and betrayal. Authorities called it unpatriotic or immoral. But if you actually sit with the book, what it's really about is redemption, how one person's attempt to atone can ripple outward and change a life. Start with the basics without spoiling everything. It follows Amir, a boy from a privileged family in Kabul, and his friendship with Hassan, the son of their servant. They fly kites together, and the kite-running scenes are breathtaking, both joyful and tense. Then something terrible happens. Amir makes a choice that saves him from immediate pain, but creates a guilt he carries into adulthood, even after he leaves Afghanistan and builds a new life abroad. That guilt is the engine of the whole novel. It's not drama for drama's sake. It's a portrait of what living with unresolved shame feels like, the way it colors relationships, the quiet ways it eats at you. When Amir returns to a changed Afghanistan years later, the book shifts into a painful but necessary reckoning. Confronting the past isn't about punishment. It's about admitting what you did, understanding why, and trying, however imperfectly, to make it right. Class and power are woven through every scene. Hassan's loyalty and the societal structures that keep him vulnerable create a backdrop that forces uncomfortable questions. Who gets to be safe? Who is expected to forgive? Why do we protect our own comfort at someone else's expense? Hosseini doesn't lecture, he shows the human cost. That's what made some people uncomfortable enough to call the novel unpatriotic, because it exposed painful truths about a nation and its people, told through very human, very flawed characters. What I love, and what I think will stick with you, is how personal the redemption feels. It's not a grand cinematic confession, it's a small, hard path. One person deciding to face the consequences of his actions, to step into danger because it's the only way to be honest with himself. That's something we can all relate to. Everyone has a moment they wish they could redo, a thing they pushed away because it was easier. The Kite Runner doesn't promise a clean fix, but it offers something better. The idea that confronting our past, even when it hurts, is the only way to heal it. If you've ever held a regret like a secret, this book will feel like a mirror. It asks you to look, to feel the discomfort, and to consider what making amends might actually look like in your own life. That's why, despite the controversy, it continues to resonate, because redemption, messy and human, is a story we keep needing to hear. Take Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. It's the book everyone remembers for the scandal, but that scandal is only the surface. Yes, the novel was banned, and yes, it shocks. But what Nabokov really wants us to look at isn't sensationalism for its own sake. He's holding up a mirror to obsession and moral blindness, showing how language, charm, and artful reasoning can make terrible things seem almost beautiful. Think about the narrator, Humbert. He's the kind of voice that can make you laugh, wince, feel sympathy, and then hate yourself for feeling any of that. Nabokov doesn't hand you a villain in a mask. He hands you someone who explains himself with elegance. That's the point. We're not meant to simply condemn Humbert from a distance. We're invited, uncomfortably, to be persuaded. That persuasive power is what unsettled censors. It's not just the act he describes, it's the way he dresses that act up in wit, sorrow, and aesthetic observation. If you've ever found yourself charmed by someone who later revealed a darker side, you already know the feeling Lolita evokes. You sit with beautiful sentences, inventive wordplay, and a narrator who frames his depravity as love. Nabokov makes this clash explicit. Beauty and horror coexist on the same page. You can admire a sentence for its music even while your stomach turns at its meaning. That cognitive dissonance is deliberate. Nabokov forces you to acknowledge how easily language can anesthetize judgment. This is why the novel was dangerous to some readers and institutions. It wasn't banned because it taught people to do bad things. It was banned because it showed how corruption looks when properly dressed up. In other words, it exposed the kinds of rationalizations and aestheticizations that allow wrongdoing to be normalized. When someone speaks eloquently, we want to believe them. Nabokov makes that instinct visible and makes us responsible for it. On a personal level, that's what I find most unsettling and useful about Lolita. It's a book that asks you to examine your own moral reflexes. Do you reject Humbert outright, or do you find yourself following his language for a page or two? Are you outraged because you're outraged, or because the narrator makes you complicit in understanding him? Those are hard questions, and they're the ones Nabokov designed the book to raise. Practically, reading Lolita is an exercise in uncomfortable attentiveness. You have to pay attention not just to what happens, but to how it's described and why that description seduces you. It's a lesson in critical reading that translates outside literature. In politics, advertising, relationships, anywhere language is used to shape perception. That's probably why the book has endured, and why it still sparks debate. It doesn't offer easy answers, but it makes you look. So when you approach Lolita, expect to be dazzled and disturbed at once. Don't let the controversy be your only lens. Look instead for the craft, the precision of image, the cruelty of charm, and the way Nabokov forces you to confront the ugly truth that beauty can be complicit in harm. That's the real horror the book exposes, and why it has refused to leave us alone. Then there's Toni Morrison's Beloved, a book that lands differently on everyone who opens it. For me, it arrived like a presence in the room, heavy, demanding attention. Morrison doesn't soften the edges. She writes about slavery, yes, but she writes about the aftermath, the ways trauma threads through motherhood and memory, how a single violent act echoes down generations. That is what made some schools remove it. Parents and administrators saw the scenes of brutality and the spectral, haunting imagery and called it too dark for students. I get the impulse to protect young people from brutality. But I also remember the first time a line in Beloved cracked something open in me. It wasn't about sensational horror. It was about being seen. Morrison's prose doesn't spare you so you can be shocked and move on. It spares nothing because it wants you to recognize the humanity in suffering, to feel the cost of that history in your bones. Reading it is like being asked to sit with someone's pain until you can't pretend it's abstract. That demand for empathy is uncomfortable, and discomfort is often why books like this get labeled too much. In classrooms I've been in, reactions were split. Some students recoiled, unable to stay in the text. Others stayed, eyes narrowing, mouths forming around memories they'd never expected to find in a novel. One student, whose grandparents had crossed borders for safety, said quietly, "I didn't know story could do that." That small confession showed why Beloved matters. It connects a historical horror to the familiar architecture of family, protection, and impossible choices. It refracts big, cold facts into living, breathing people. Arguments for banning usually center on shielding youth from violence. Arguments against say that stripping books like Beloved from curricula strips away a chance to practice empathy, to confront the past honestly. Both concerns are valid. The middle way I've seen work is careful facilitation. Give content warnings, provide historical context, build space for reflection, and encourage students to step back when they need to. Treat the book as a challenge, not a trap. Let it unsettle, and then guide the conversation toward understanding why that unsettlement exists. Great literature often unsettles before it enlightens. Morrison's ending, which leaves questions and ghosts rather than neat answers, does precisely that. It refuses comfort and forces you to reckon with costs that don't wrap up on the page. If you read Beloved, don't expect ease. Expect to be changed, slowly and sometimes painfully. Expect moments of recognition and expect silences afterward as readers digest what they've been made to see. So when you think about whether a novel is too dark, consider what darkness is doing in the story. With Morrison, it's not spectacle, it's witness. It asks us to hold hard truths together with the tenderness of a mother's love, and that tension, that insistence on empathy, is why the book remains necessary, even when it unsettles. The Diary of Anne Frank. A slim, handwritten book with a red and white checkered cover. That's how Anne's voice first reaches most of us. Open it, and you don't find a historical textbook or a solemn monument. You find a 14-year-old who wants to be an author, who worries about pimples, who quarrels with her mother, who falls in love with the idea of falling in love. She writes about the everyday in a place designed to strip every day away. That tension is what makes the diary devastating and why it became a global testimony. Think about the last time you wrote something just for yourself. A note, a journal entry, a late-night message to someone you trust. There's a freedom in addressing a blank page. Anne used that freedom inside the secret annex to name small things. The smell of coffee, the sound of a piano downstairs, the way seasons moved through the barred light. Those details do more than humanize history. They make the horror comprehensible. When you recognize a teenager's laugh or jealousy in the middle of atrocity, the statistics become people. That's dangerous to those who want victims reduced to numbers, which is why the diary has been challenged and even banned. Critics call it too emotional, too personal, too political. They say it belongs in a private drawer, not on school reading lists. They claim its youthful voice is unfit for public education, but censors missed the point. The diary's danger is not some subversive ideology, It's empathy. It insists we see a girl, not merely an emblem. It refuses anonymity. And when you refuse to let cruelty erase individuality, you undermine the narratives that made that cruelty possible. There's also courage in that plainness. Anne doesn't always offer polished reflections. She questions herself, contradicts herself, dreams big and fears small. That rawness is relatable. You don't have to be a historian to connect. You remember being awkward, hungry for approval, convinced the world will never understand you. Seeing that in Anne makes her fate hit closer to home. It becomes harder to look away and harder to let hatred be abstract. So the diary matters not because it is a perfect document, but because it is a human one. It teaches us how ordinary life can persist in the worst of circumstances. How someone can hold a book, a pen, and an inner life when everything outside is collapsing. If there's a lesson for us now, it's simple and stubborn. Human voices survive attempts to silence them. Even in horror, the human voice remains unextinguished. Next, John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. A book that didn't just tell a story, it made a whole country squirm. On the surface, it follows the Joad family, tenant farmers pushed off their Oklahoma land by the Dust Bowl and the Depression, crammed into an old truck and headed west to California, chasing the promise of work and safety. But Steinbeck was doing something bigger. He braided intimate moments. Majad's stubborn tenderness, Tom's hard-won conscience, the small kindnesses between strangers, with sweeping, almost documentary sections that show the scale of the suffering. That combination is what made it impossible to ignore. When you read about the Joads, it's hard not to feel them as real people. You can smell the dust on their clothes, feel the weight of the trunk they've packed, hear the ways they keep insisting they'll be okay, even when everything says they're not. That intimacy is what gives the novel its power. It turns statistics into faces and policies into broken promises. For a reader today, it can feel painfully personal. Maybe you think of grandparents or neighbors who survived hard times, or you imagine what it would be like to lose the place that made you who you are. And because it showed poverty, inequality, and corporate greed so vividly, the book provoked fear. Landowners, bankers, some politicians and newspapers attacked Steinbeck. The novel was banned in towns and even burned in public. Why? Because when people see the human cost of economic decisions, the way big interests profit while families are crushed, it becomes harder to look the other way. Voices that remember pain threaten the neat stories power prefers, that the system is fair, that failure is personal, that the suffering is somehow deserved. Steinbeck gave a voice to those who had been written out of mainstream narratives. The intercalary chapters, the panoramic snapshots between the Joad scenes, create a chorus of ordinary lives and shared desperation. Characters like Ma Joad aren't just individuals. They become representative of resilience, grief, and moral courage. When Tom says, "I'll be all around in the dark, I'll be everywhere," it feels less like melodrama and more like a promise. Memory and resistance don't vanish just because someone tries to erase them. That's why the reaction to the novel matters today. Burning books, trying to ban them, silencing accounts of injustice. These are efforts to stop people from remembering and connecting the dots. But stories survive. They teach empathy. They make abstract injustices tangible. If you've ever had someone else's story change the way you see the world, a news piece that opened your eyes, a family tale that shifted your priorities, you know what Steinbeck was aiming for. Keep that sense of how literature turns pain into witness in mind as we look at other works that didn't just reflect their times but challenged them, the ones that made readers uncomfortable enough to try and shut them up. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I remember being handed my first copy in middle school and thinking it was just another classic I had to get through. By the second chapter I was hooked, not because it was comfortable, but precisely because it wasn't. Scout's voice is charming and funny, and then the book pulls you into scenes that make your chest tighten. That tension is the point. This book has been banned and challenged for decades. People protested its language and the way it lays bare racial injustice. They wanted to shield readers from painful words and images, as if keeping kids from discomfort would keep them safe from the ugliness of history. But here's the hard truth. Empathy isn't born in a vacuum. It grows when we let ourselves feel outraged, ashamed, confused, and heartbroken. Reading about Tom Robinson's trial, seeing Atticus stand alone in the courtroom, hearing Scout describe the neighborhood gossip, those moments teach us to notice injustice, to name it, to feel it. Harper Lee didn't write to wound for the sake of wounding. She wrote to expose cruelty through innocence. Scout and Gem are the lenses that make the cruelty visible, but also humanize the people involved in it. That contrast, childlike curiosity against systemic brutality, forces us to ask why terrible things happen and who benefits when we look away. When a school board decides the book is too controversial, what they're really doing is choosing comfort over confrontation. They're choosing to hide a story that could have been the first time a reader recognizes a pattern of harm and decides it's unacceptable. I've seen what happens when teachers use the book as a starting point rather than an end point. In classes where students were allowed to wrestle with the language and context, conversations got messy, but they were also transformative. Kids admitted they didn't know the history, felt uncomfortable with their own assumptions, and began to listen to classmates whose families had different experiences. That's the kind of learning a ban prevents. Every removal of this book is a refusal to confront history, to teach the hard lessons that matter. It's not just about one novel, it's about whether we trust young people to handle complexity. If we shelter them from all pain, we also shelter them from the tools to respond to pain, critical thinking, compassion, and courage. So when you hear that To Kill a Mockingbird is controversial, don't treat that as a warning label. Treat it as an invitation to read, discuss, question, and feel. The aim isn't to traumatize, it's to awaken. Ulysses by James Joyce. Book that made censors furious, not because it was crude, but because it insisted on being completely free. Ulysses reads like someone has left a recorder running inside a human skull for a day. We follow Leopold Bloom through Dublin on June 16, 1904, but what Joyce really gives us is the flow of thought, quick shifts, unfinished sentences, private jokes, sudden sensual images, and synaptic leaps from a smell to a memory to a moral question. For a lot of people in the early 20th century, that felt like an invasion. It violated the neat boundaries between public and private, between proper writing and the messy chatter of actual minds. That invasion is why it was branded obscene. But the obscenity censors feared was less about sex scenes on a page and more about freedom. Freedom of language, of form, of moral perspective. Joyce rejects the idea that narration must be tidy and authoritative. Instead, he hands you language in fragments, in rhythms that mimic breathing, in parodies of other literary styles, and in a moral viewpoint that's messy, ambivalent, and humane. To authorities who believed literature should teach, tidy up, or uphold social norms, Ulysses was dangerous because it taught nothing neat and cleaned up nothing. Reading it can feel disorienting at first. You might start an episode and think, what on earth is happening? Then you catch a cadence, a joke, a repeated image, and suddenly you're inside a person. Not a polished character, but someone made of habits, embarrassments, tenderness, and bodily needs. Molly Bloom's final soliloquy, with its breathless, punctuation-free yeses and memories, is a perfect example. Raw, intimate, gloriously human. If you've ever had a thought so private you'd blush to say it out loud, Ulysses will put that thought in lights and ask you to meet it without flinching. There's also Joyce's technical daring. Every episode experiments with a different style, from catechism to pastiche to a play script parody, which not only showcases his virtuosity, but also keeps the reader active. You can't be passive with Ulysses. You have to think, feel, and sometimes puzzle your way through. That demand felt threatening then in a way, it might not now, but the effect is the same. The book refuses to let you look at life through a moralizing window. It hands you the window and asks you to look in. So, why does it matter today? In an age of curated online selves and instant moral judgment, the raw, confusing interiority Joyce gives us can be oddly liberating. Ulysses reminds you that thoughts are not tidy, that morality is complicated, and that literature can be a space where language itself is free to roam. The censorship it faced wasn't just about specific passages. It was a panic about letting people think freely. And that's a panic worth remembering. The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie. On the page, it's a dizzy, dazzling blend of magical realism, myth, and memory. Characters who tumble out of a plane crash, gods who argue in the streets, and whole cities refracted through one man's dreams. Read casually, it's a work about identity, migration, faith, and the way our pasts keep whispering to us. But what made the book explosive wasn't a tidy plot twist or a villain. It was the simple, terrible power of imagination to rework sacred stories. Imagine for a moment you're the kind of person who reads to understand others, to test ideas, to feel what it might be like to live inside someone else's mind. For many of us, that impulse is how we learn empathy. Rushdie took that impulse and aimed it at religion, not to ridicule belief for sport, but to ask what legend and scripture mean to people who carry them in their bones. That approach struck millions as brilliant and necessary. It also struck some as unforgivable. What followed showed how fragile the boundary between fiction and life can be. Governments banned the book, protests swept cities, fatwas and death threats turned words on a page into an actual hunt. The author himself had to live under a cloud that could, and did, lead to violence against translators and others connected to the work. Suddenly, the act of writing was more than art. It was a decision with a real, often dangerous cost. This is the part that should unsettle us. The novel's danger wasn't that it told a scandalous story. It was that it suggested sacred narratives could be reimagined. That suggestion alone felt like an offense to some. The idea that holy texts, that which gives people meaning and order, might be seen through a different lens. For people whose identities are bound to those texts, reinterpretation felt like erasure. For others, it was a necessary challenge, a way to ask whether tradition must be static or whether it could evolve. On a personal level, think about the stories you were raised on. They shaped how you saw family, duty, right and wrong. Now imagine someone you respect telling a subtly different version of those legends, not to wound, but to understand how those meanings change in another place or time. It's intimate, it's threatening, it can make us defensive, even furious. That's why the Satanic Verses became more than a novel. It became a battleground over who gets to define truth in public life. There's a lesson here that trumps the particulars of any controversy. Freedom of speech isn't just a right to publish comfortable ideas. It's the right to publish the uncomfortable ones and to accept that consequences may follow. Rushdie's ordeal reminded the world that saying something risky can cost you safety, relationships, even career opportunities. And it reminded authors and readers alike of a strange truth. Fiction doesn't stay politely confined to the page. It leaks into homes, into law, into geopolitics. When imagination touches belief, it can redraw borders we thought were fixed. So when we talk about censored books, banned ideas, or the penalties of speaking one's mind, Rushdie's experience is a cautionary tale and a call to courage. It forces us to ask, how do we protect people's safety while preserving the messy, essential work of reimagining the world? The Communist Manifesto arrived in 1848 like a thrown match. In just a few dozen pages, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels laid out a simple, violent idea. The working class, people who labored, paid rents, raised children, swept floors, should recognize their shared condition and act to change it. That sentence alone sounds abstract until you imagine holding that pamphlet in your hands in a crowded factory town, smelling coal and sweat, and realizing someone had named the invisible forces making your life harder. What's striking is how direct it was. Workers of the world, unite wasn't academic jargon aimed at scholars. It was a call. It said inequality wasn't destiny or divine will. It was the product of historical rules that could be rewritten. For people who were tired, hungry, or watching their children inherit the same cramped life they'd been born into, those words felt like permission to hope and a plan to act. Governments noticed, not politely. Monarchies, dictatorships, even many capitalist states treated the Manifesto as dangerous enough to ban it outright. Why? Because the idea that reading alone could ignite revolt terrified those in power. They didn't only fear rallies and barricades, they feared the slow, contagious spread of a new way of seeing the world. In several places, it was illegal merely to possess the text. No distribution, no quiet study at home. Imagine that. Governments criminalizing a pamphlet because they understood that ideas seed action. That fear reveals something about the written word. It can shift the balance of power. A short, accessible tract traveled faster than troops could move. It translated economic theories into everyday language and gave people a shared vocabulary for anger and hope. For some, the Manifesto read like prophecy, an explanation of forces they saw shaping their lives. For others, it was poison, the blueprint for upheaval that threatened property, hierarchies, and the status quo. We all have an angle on this. Maybe you felt a book change how you see your job, your city, or your future. Maybe a single article convinced you to change careers, to move, to speak up. That's the same mechanism at work here. Words reframing experience until it looks actionable. When a text resonates with lived frustration, it can turn private grievances into public movements. Of course, interpreting Marx and Engels hasn't been simple. Some used their ideas to build social safety nets and labor rights. Others used them to justify brutal regimes. That moral messiness is part of the Manifesto's legacy, proof that the power of a text doesn't determine the purity of its outcomes. It can enlighten, inspire, and terrify in equal measure. So when we talk about the Communist Manifesto today, we're not just talking about a 19th century pamphlet. We're talking about a historic example of how readable ideas can cross borders, survive bans, and force people to ask, who benefits from the current rules, and who pays the price? That tension between words on paper and the real-world power they can unleash still shapes debates, protests, and policies now, almost 2 centuries later. The Bible. On paper, it's simple. A collection of sacred texts read by billions, translated into languages across the globe, printed more times than any other book in history. But peel back a layer and you find something far more combustible. For centuries, the Bible has been treated not just as scripture, but as a source of authority, and that authority made rulers, bishops, and governments nervous. The conflict usually wasn't over the words themselves, but over who was allowed to read and explain them. Think about medieval Europe. Manuscripts were rare, and the people who copied and interpreted them were often the same people in power. When lay people began asking for translations into their own languages, it threatened an entire system that depended on a centralized interpretation. The story of William Tyndale, who translated the Bible into English and paid for it with his life, is a blunt example of how dangerous that simple act of translation could be. The Church's Index of Forbidden Books later formalized the impulse: control the text, control the meaning, control the people. It's easy to imagine censorship as something that happens elsewhere, in dusty archives or distant regimes, but the pattern repeats in modern settings too. Totalitarian governments have restricted or monitored Bibles not necessarily because the text contradicts their laws, but because a text that people can read for themselves becomes a seedbed for independent thought, community organization, and moral critique. In Soviet Russia, in parts of China, and in other states, access to religious literature was tightly managed. In some places you could own a Bible, but only a state-approved edition, with annotations that steered interpretation in a safe direction. That tension, a book promising salvation and also offering a kind of spiritual autonomy, is the heart of the irony. The Bible contains passages urging compassion, justice, and personal conscience. Those are exactly the ideas that can unsettle authorities who rely on obedience. So, a text meant to unify humanity in spirit ends up being forbidden by people who fear its power to inspire independent thought. This isn't just history. I grew up with a family story about a neighbor who kept a battered pocket Bible under the floorboards during a time of censorship. He'd read passages quietly at night, and the act of reading became an act of resistance, not dramatic or violent, just stubborn and human. When I first heard that story, it changed how I think about books. A book isn't just ink and paper, it's a tool that can shape how people see themselves and the world. That's why those in power have often tried to limit who gets to hold the tool. So when we talk about banned books, the Bible forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Censorship is rarely only about content. It's about control. Control of meaning, control of conscience, control of community. The irony is sharp and personal. The same pages that comfort and unite can also liberate minds in ways that make others deeply uneasy. Now, the Qur'an. Think of it not as a book sitting on a shelf, but as a heartbeat that keeps time for millions of lives. That's why the reaction to it has rarely been about ink and paper. Time and again, bans on the Qur'an haven't targeted its pages so much as the people who carry it into the world. The believers who read it aloud, argue about it, teach it to children, and let its words shape how they see themselves. That distinction matters. In some non-Islamic countries, restrictions came when authorities decided that a steady, visible practice of Islam might redraw social lines. When a group taught its kids prayers in a community center, or when new converts carried Quranic verses into public life. The worry wasn't that the text said something violent or illegal. It was that it might reorient loyalties, create parallel communities, or inspire people to act on a conscience the state could not fully control. And within the Muslim world, the story repeats, but with a different target. There, bans sometimes fall on particular translations, commentaries, or gatherings, not because the Qur'an itself is forbidden, but because certain interpretations are seen as politically destabilizing. A verse read one way can be comforting. Read another way, it can be empowering, demanding accountability from leaders or insisting on rights long deferred. Rulers who rely on a narrow narrative of identity often feel threatened when alternative readings give people language to question that story. This is personal in ways that are easy to miss from the outside. I remember a friend who told me about finding an old Qur'an tucked into a suitcase after her grandmother passed. For years, the family had treated it like a private talisman, opened for weddings, closed for funerals, until one cousin decided to read aloud in the living room. The small act of hearing those words transformed the room. Some people wept. Others, who had never spoken about faith at all, leaned in and began asking questions. The book didn't change by being opened, the people did. Those who ban the Qur'an, or specific ways of reading it, are not always trying to silence theology. They're trying to manage identity. They fear that words, once learned and shared, will travel beyond a controlled narrative and bind people to a different moral imagination. That is why censorship often looks less like an attack on religion and more like an attempt to cut the roots of a community's sense of self. But ideas are stubborn. Copies can be hidden, verses memorized, podcasts recorded and shared. The Qur'an has a history of surviving attempts to confine it because its power lies not in where the pages are stored, but in the voices that carry them. And that's what unsettles so many authorities. The irreversible way faith, once it takes hold, reshapes how people see themselves and their place in the world. 1984 by George Orwell. Take George Orwell's 1984. Not just as a book, but as a kind of cultural X-ray. I remember the first time I read it. The air felt colder, like someone had turned on a light in a room I'd thought was empty. It wasn't just the story of Winston or the bleakness of Oceania. It was the slow, creeping recognition that a lot of ordinary things we accept can be bent into tools of control. That personal chill is exactly why so many governments, across very different systems, tried to ban it. On one side, the Soviet Union labeled it anti-communist propaganda. On the other, parts of the West reacted as if it were dangerously subversive. That should make us pause. A novel that offends both enemies and allies of freedom is probably hitting on something more universal than party politics. Orwell didn't invent a political party. He described mechanisms, surveillance, enforced language, manufactured realities that any power hungry enough could adopt. What makes 1984 stay with you is its mirror quality. When you read about telescreens, endless rewriting of history, or Newspeak narrowing thought, you don't just see a fictional society. You look at institutions, at corporations, at governments, and you squint. How are we already normalizing similar habits? Cameras in public spaces, algorithms that shape what we see, euphemisms that sanitize violent policy. These are not single-party inventions. They're tools, and tools can be picked up by anyone. That's why banning 1984 almost feels like a confession. If a regime burns or bans a book that anticipates its tactics, it's implicitly admitting, we recognize the portrait and we don't like being seen. Banning becomes a proof of concept. Big Brother wasn't merely imaginative. When you forbid the mirror, you're revealing the face you don't want others to recognize. Make it personal again. Think about the last time you felt watched. Not just cameras, but the pressure to phrase things a certain way, to avoid a joke that could be taken as literal. Maybe it was at work, where email is monitored. Maybe it was online, where one post can be amplified and misconstrued. Maybe it was in a classroom or family dinner, where a single topic is taboo. Those micro moments are the everyday echoes of Orwell's big warnings. They're small, but accumulative. That's what made the book so dangerous to multiple regimes. It teaches you what to look for. So when you hear about 1984 being banned, whether in a state with a red star or a market-driven democracy, don't chalk it up to ideological squabbling. Take it as a signal. The act of silencing a story that shows systems their reflection is itself a reflection of fear. And that fear is the real story Orwell wanted us to see. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Imagine being born into a system where your job, your friends, even your tastes are decided for you before you can think for yourself. Huxley's vision does exactly that. People are created and conditioned to fit neat social slots. Alphas who run things, epsilons who do the manual work, and they're taught from infancy to be satisfied with their place. The society is engineered for obedience, and everyone is kept pleasantly distracted by sex, consumerism, and a little blue pill called soma that erases discomfort. On the surface, it looks like paradise, no suffering, no conflict, constant leisure. That calmness is what makes it chilling. There's no art that unsettles, no ideas that threaten the peace, because dissent has been drained of its fuel. Huxley was asking, what happens to a human being when the hard, uncomfortable parts of life are removed? Do we become more humane or less human? It's easy to see why religious and political groups condemned the book. Huxley's world openly treats sex as casual and publicity-less morality. It celebrates conformity, and it normalizes a drug that manufactures happiness. Those themes hit cultural nerves, but they're not the deepest layer. Brave New World isn't merely a list of banned ideas. It's a warning about what we lose when we choose comfort over freedom. That choice doesn't always look like oppression. In the novel, citizens buy into the system. Conditioning, education, and a steady stream of pleasures make surrender feel like an obvious, even rational option. And that's the part that should make you pause. Think about how often you choose convenience. An algorithm that curates your news so you never see challenging viewpoints. A streaming service that autoplays the next show so you keep watching without deciding. a pill or a scrolling session that quiets anxiety for a while. Those small surrenders mirror Huxley's idea, a slow, willing trade of autonomy for ease. Characters like Bernard and John the Savage illuminate the human cost. Bernard senses the hollowness but is torn by the benefits. John, raised outside the world state, finds their happiness obscene precisely because it's so controlled. Their struggles feel personal because we've all been tempted to take the easy route at the expense of something more demanding but meaningful. So the novel becomes less about dystopian mechanisms and more about the psychology of consent. If control can be disguised as comfort, how vigilant should we be about the comforts we accept? That question is Huxley's gift. He doesn't just frighten us with a future of domination. He presses us to examine the present choices that might lead there. Take a moment now to think about the comforts you'd be hard-pressed to give up. What values might be slipping away with them? Next up, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, a book about banning books, and one of those rare novels whose bleak warning keeps echoing louder the more the world ignores it. Picture this, a future where firemen don't put out flames, they start them. Guy Montag is one of those firemen. His job is to burn books, to erase inconvenient ideas, and to maintain a public that's maddeningly content because it never has to confront complexity. Early in the story, a chance conversation with a young neighbor, Clarice, cracks something open in Montag. She asks simple questions. Why read? What do you truly feel? And those questions, like kindling, begin to burn down the walls of his complacency. What always hits me about Bradbury is how literally he turns censorship into spectacle. Fire is beautiful on the surface. It's warm, immediate, mesmerizing. But the fire in this world consumes the raw material of thought. The scenes where books go up in flames are written so vividly you can almost smell the pages, and that sensory detail makes the loss feel real, intimate. It's not just institutions being silenced, it's people losing parts of themselves. There's a painful irony that has followed this book since it came out. Fahrenheit 451 is itself repeatedly targeted by the same impulse it condemns. Over the decades, it's been challenged in schools, scrutinized by libraries, and sometimes pulled because critics didn't like its language, themes, or the fact that it concerns censorship. A book warning against controlling ideas has been controlled. That irony isn't academic. It's personal. When I first read it, I remember feeling outraged and a little betrayed that a story pleading for the right to think freely could be treated as a threat. It made the message land harder. At its core, Bradbury gives us a simple, brutal equation. Stop reading, stop thinking. Stop thinking, stop being free. It's not just about books as objects. It's about the habits they represent, questioning, dissent, the slow work of paying attention. Montag's arc from obedient burner to someone willing to risk exile for ideas is a reminder that freedom isn't handed out, it's cultivated. Clarice's curiosity and the rebellious fragments of text people memorize later in the novel show that ideas survive in human memory when they're denied physical form. But would you want your history kept that way, fragile and secret? For anyone watching this who's ever felt that reading takes too much time or that controversy around a book feels exaggerated, imagine a world where your choices, your conversations, even your small private rebellions are simplified for you. Bradbury's point isn't a call to hoard books like relics. It's a plea to keep thinking, to keep asking why. So when you see a book labeled controversial or hear calls to restrict certain ideas, think about Montag standing in front of a pile of burning pages and ask yourself which side you'd be on. The novel doesn't offer neat solutions, but it does remind us that the simplest acts, reading, questioning, remembering, are the foundation of freedom. That's a message worth taking personally. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. When I first read The Handmaid's Tale, I remember a chill that wasn't just from the story itself, but from how real it felt, like a clock starting to tick. Atwood didn't write a prophecy, she wrote a warning. That framing matters. The book isn't shouting, "This will happen." It's saying, "This could happen if we stop paying attention." That's why the novel has been fought over and banned for decades. It pulls back the curtain on mechanisms of control that some people would rather not examine. There's a painful irony in the attempts to remove Atwood's book from classrooms and libraries. The people who try to silence it often act like the exact systems it describes, deciding who gets to read, which ideas are allowed, which bodies are allowed autonomy. When a text about the politics of censorship and female subjugation is censored, the act itself becomes a kind of footnote to the book's thesis. It's uncomfortable, but it's also instructive. You can judge the strength of an argument by watching the reaction it provokes. For me, the most haunting scenes are never just about the rules of Gilead. They're about the small, human resistances. It's in the way Offred remembers songs, names, or small gestures. Things that seem trivial until you realize how dangerous they can be in a state that wants to erase individuality. That's where Atwood's skill lies. She shows how ordinary memory and ordinary relationships can become radical acts when everything else is stripped away. And then there are the red robes. Atwood couldn't have predicted all the specific ways readers would use her imagery, but she understood the power of symbol. When people turn those red cloaks into protest costumes, they're doing more than cosplay. They're translating fiction into public language, saying, "We see you" to those in power and "we will not be made invisible to each other." I remember seeing photos of protesters in red and feeling a sting of recognition. This was a story that had jumped out of a book and into the streets. That's the proof that stories can outlive control. A regime can ban a book, burn copies, or erase it from curricula, but a story has a different life. It lives in memory, in protest art, in conversations between people who refuse to be silent. When you hear someone reference Offred's quiet rebellion or see a red robe at a courthouse, you witness literature doing the thing it was meant to do, shaping how we think about power, empathy, and rights. So when we argue about banning The Handmaid's Tale, we're not just arguing about a novel. We're confronting questions about who gets to tell which stories, who benefits from silence, and how we teach the next generation to recognize danger before it's a fait accompli. The book's urgency comes from that insistence: read, remember, act, because prevention starts with attention. A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. Burgess doesn't just show violence to shock us. He pulls us into the life of Alex, a kid who loves music, ultraviolence, and power. If you read it thinking it's a celebration of brutality, it's easy to see why censors panicked. The book is full of brutal scenes, written in a slang that makes you both repelled and strangely complicit. But Burgess's point isn't to glamorize the violence. It's to make that violence a symptom of something deeper, the stripping away of choice. Think about the famous Ludovico technique, the state's attempt to cure Alex by conditioning him to associate violence with unbearable sickness. On the surface, people cheered when the violent kid was made harmless. But Burgess asks the hard question: if Alex is no longer free to choose, is his goodness really goodness at all? It's the difference between someone refusing to hurt because they understand and someone refusing because a machine makes them feel sick. One is moral agency, the other is puppetry. That was the idea that infuriated authorities. Censors mistook depiction for endorsement. They saw the vivid scenes and assumed the novel celebrated them. They missed the moral experiment at the core. Burgess wanted readers to feel the discomfort, to watch a person who once chose evil be converted into someone who no longer has a moral compass to exercise. The horror, then, isn't the spree of violence. It's the sterilization of choice, the bureaucratic machinery that programs morality like a piece of clockwork. On a personal level, this unsettles me. We've all been in situations where doing the right thing felt less like a choice and more like following a script. in schools, at work, in relationships. Burgess pushes that feeling to the extreme. He makes you ask whether a system that eliminates moral struggle is actually improving people or simply creating a population of predictable, controllable units. There's a human cost to predictability, empathy, remorse, the messy process by which we learn to be good. The novel also makes an interesting claim about art and beauty. Alex loves Beethoven. His love of music survives, even when his body recoils at the thought of committing violence. That clash, sublime music paired with moral corruption, forces us to separate aesthetic appreciation from ethical behavior. It complicates easy judgments. Can someone who revels in art still be monstrous? Conversely, can someone made incapable of evil still be called virtuous? Burgess wanted us to confront these contradictions. If you're reading it now, don't rush to decide whether Alex is villain or victim. Notice how the state replaces one kind of tyranny, the anarchic violence of youth, with another, the technocratic control over the soul. That's the real nightmare the book warns us about. It asks us to protect the messy, imperfect freedom that allows goodness to mean anything at all. So next time you catch yourself applauding any quick fix that promises better behavior, remember Alex. The question Burgess leaves us with is personal. Would you rather live in a world of coerced goodness or in a world where people are free and therefore responsible for the choices they make? Animal Farm by George Orwell. Take George Orwell's Animal Farm. It's short, almost breezy at first glance. Clever animals, a toppled farmer, hopeful speeches about equality. But the joke, and the punch, is that the pigs who lead the revolution slowly start to look and act like the humans they replaced. That simple twist is what made this book dangerous to those in power. Governments didn't ban it because it was complicated or subtle. They banned it because it was shockingly obvious. When I first read Animal Farm, I was surprised by how much it felt like something I'd already seen around me. Not the literal pigs and fences, but the pattern, promises of change, slogans that simplify complex problems, leaders who begin by asking for small sacrifices and end up demanding everything. That pattern isn't confined to history books. It shows up in classrooms where group projects turn into one person calling all the shots, in offices where, for the good of the team, becomes a way to silence dissent, even in friend groups where one person starts setting the rules. The animals on the farm are exaggerated, but their story is a mirror. Orwell's genius is the novel's simplicity. He stripped away jargon, ideology, and complicated backstory, and left a story almost anyone can map onto their own experience. That made it readable, and readable equals dangerous in the eyes of regimes that depend on people not connecting the dots. If citizens can read a simple tale and say, "That looks familiar," then propaganda loses its grip. You can outlaw a book, but you can't erase the pattern it reveals. People will recognize it in their workplaces, in their media feeds, in their politics. There's also a human side to this. The betrayal in Animal Farm stings because it's so ordinary. Revolutions are supposed to fix things. When they don't, the disappointment is more painful than if nothing had ever been tried. That's why the book cuts so deep. It forces you to ask uncomfortable questions. What promises do I accept because I want to believe? When do I stop calling out bad behavior because it comes from someone I trusted? Those are personal questions, not just political ones. If a story can make you rethink small choices at work or in your friendships, imagine what it does on a national scale. That's why Animal Farm was seen as subversive. Its truth is portable, easy to carry into any conversation. And that's the last thing some people in power want, not because the book is loud, but because it's quiet and honest. You can ban a story, but you can't ban the way people begin to see the world differently after reading it. Take Anton LaVey's The Satanic Bible. A book that, in one sense, is a masterclass in how a title can do the heavy lifting of scandal. I still remember the first time I saw it on a shelf, glossy black cover, The word Satanic sprawled across the top, and people giving me the sort of sideways glances you get when you're holding something that looks like a middle school dare. A few pages in, though, and the image you expect starts to unravel. LaVey wasn't writing hymns to a supernatural devil. He was arguing for rebellion in a different register, self-rule, fierce individualism, and a hard-nosed rejection of hypocrisy. The Satan in his pages is more symbol than deity. A figure who stands for questioning, for pleasure, for taking responsibility for your own life, instead of outsourcing morality to institutions that don't always earn our trust. To read it is to be nudged toward thinking for yourself, not to bow to some otherworldly command. That distinction rarely matters to the people who want the book removed. It's often banned for its title alone, slotted out of school libraries, challenged at bookshops, used as shorthand in moral panics. And that says something important about us. Sometimes it's the name of a thing that scares people more than the content. A taboo word can trigger fear, and fear shortcuts curiosity. Books with provocative titles become symbols, easy targets when the real conversation would be harder, dirtier, and more complicated. Personally, I find that more revealing than the outrage itself. It makes me wonder how many of our decisions about art and ideas are defensive gestures, reflexive attempts to keep the unfamiliar out rather than to engage with it. I've watched friends, people I respect, react to the title of LaVey's book like a red flag, without ever opening it. And I get that instinct. Nobody wants their children exposed to content they find harmful. But I also think that stripping a text of its nuance, because a single word is uncomfortable, does a disservice to our collective ability to wrestle with difficult ideas. LaVey's pages invite a messy, sometimes uncomfortable honesty. Celebrate what's human, call out hypocrisy when you see it, and don't pretend moral high ground where there's only sanctimony. Whether you agree with him or not isn't the point. The point is that fear of a word shouldn't be a substitute for thought. When a title alone can make a book radioactive, it tells you more about cultural anxiety than about the actual arguments inside. And that, to me, is a conversation worth having. The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. On the surface, it looks like a handful of bad words and a moody teenager wandering Manhattan. The classic reasons parents and school boards pointed to when they tried to ban it. But if you actually sit with Holden Caulfield for a while, the real friction becomes clear. It's not just the language or the rebellion. It's the way he names what we all sometimes feel and then refuses to smooth it over. I remember the first time I read it, lying on my back in a college dorm, thinking, this guy is so honest it hurts. Holden's voice is messy and scattershot, but it's honest in a way that classrooms were never taught to be. He calls people phony, he admits to fear and loneliness, and he notices the small hypocrisies that adults around him either accept or ignore. For teens, and anyone who's ever been young and fed up, that kind of candidness feels like air. It's a relief and a threat at the same time. Adults often misunderstood what they were banning. They saw profanity and defiance. They called it harmful. But the deeper threat was the mirror Salinger held up. Teen readers saw their own disillusionment reflected back and didn't like what they saw, and adults saw something else, the reminder of an honesty they had abandoned. Holden's refusal to perform social niceties exposed the gap between authentic feeling and polite conformity. That recognition was dangerous because it could spread. If kids started naming what felt false in the world, adults could no longer assume everything was fine. Ask yourself, how does it feel when someone points out a truth you've been avoiding? Embarrassing, maybe. Uncomfortable, definitely. That's what Salinger's book did for a generation. Reading Holden was like overhearing your own private gripes made public, and when private gripes become public, they become contagious. Banning the book didn't just remove bad words, it attempted to silence an attitude, a way of seeing that might challenge comfortable stories adults told themselves about maturity, success, and sincerity. That's also why The Catcher in the Rye still matters. It doesn't give tidy answers. It's not trying to fix Holden. It's offering him as proof that confusion and grief and anger are legitimate experiences. If you've ever felt like the world expects you to perform before it listens, Holden is a kind of permission slip. It's okay to be messy, to be honest, to refuse to fake your way through things. So when people tried to ban this novel, they weren't just policing language, they were trying to mute authenticity, the very quality that makes youth so unnerving and, ultimately, so necessary.